There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man the week after he buries his father. It isn't peace, it's closer to holding your breath in a house that used to be loud. Silas Boone had been living inside that quiet since March, and by October it hadn't lifted. He knew what they said about him at the feed store when he wasn't in earshot. Boone's boys in over his head. He'd heard some version of that his whole life. 14 and too slow with a rifle, 19 and home from 2 years at the ag college, having learned mostly that he didn't fully belong anywhere. He'd spent a long time being a disappointing kind of adequate. You stop noticing the rub of that until somebody points at your foot in front of a crowd. That was the morning, October 14, 1963, when somebody pointed. The Cutter Valley stockyard sat in a low bowl of land that trapped sound the way a held breath traps heat, and 30 men were leaning on that rail when they brought her into the ring. She came in wrong. Coat too thick for the season, coarse as rope, patched over in a duller rust brown that didn't sit right against the darker undercoat beneath, like two animals stitched together by somebody in a hurry. Her back dipped low behind the shoulders and rose sharp toward the hip. Legs short, thick, planted square, nothing like the long, clean lines of the Herefords walked through ahead of her. She held her head low, chewing, entirely uninterested in the fact that 30 men were about to decide what she was worth. Grady Voss laughed first, and it wasn't a small laugh. Big man, sun-cracked at the neck, 400 head of clean Hereford stock on the spread bordering the Boone place, a man who had never once had to find out what he was like when things went wrong. "Boys, somebody bred a buffalo to a doormat." He didn't lower his voice. 50 says nobody here even opens the bidding. 2 men by the gate laughed outright. The auctioneer's assistant, 17 and should have known better, ducked his head over his clipboard to hide a grin. Silas didn't feel the second-hand shame he expected to feel on the animal's behalf. He felt something closer to recognition. He knew exactly what it looked like when a room decided something wasn't worth taking seriously before it had done anything at all to earn that judgment. He made himself look past what the crowd had already decided. The chest was deep. The legs carried real bone under that short frame, and the coat, dense, doubled, an outer layer over a thick undercoat lying close to the body, built to shed water fast and hold heat against the skin. A coat built for a season that hadn't arrived yet. 50 says he's right, Grady called again, bigger laugh this time. Silas raised 2 fingers off the rail, barely a motion at all. 50. The auctioneer's chant faltered, real surprise breaking 20 years of rhythm, then rolled forward faster, sensing something worth speeding toward. Nobody topped it. The gavel came down in 11 seconds, the fastest sale of the morning, and the silence after it hung a beat too long. "Well," Grady grinned at the man beside him, voice carrying to the gate, "there goes his tractor money." Silas walked to collect her and didn't look back at the rail. Not looking back cost him something specific, the discovery, in front of 30 strangers, that he was capable of choosing not to flinch. She came without a fight, the way an animal comes when it's already decided a person isn't worth resisting. Up close, she was homelier still. Old scar tissue along one flank, ribs a man could count if he wanted to be unkind. He ran a hand down her neck and found more muscle under that coat than he'd expected. "You got a name?" She leaned slightly into his hand. That was the whole answer, and it was enough. His mother, Ruth, was on the porch shelling beans when he backed up to the loading chute. "That's not the auger." "No, ma'am." "That's a cow." "Yes, ma'am." Ruth set the bowl down beside her, unhurried. 7 months a widow, and in that time she had raised her voice at exactly nothing, not from calm, but from rationing something she wasn't certain she had enough of left. She looked the animal over a long moment. Grady Wass's boy was through the feed store telling anybody who'd stand still that you paid $50 for the ugliest animal in 3 counties. Heard him say it himself. And bought her anyway. Yes, ma'am. Ruth didn't ask why. She picked the beans back up, and her hands moved steady in the low light, and she didn't look up again. Word moved through Cutter Valley the way water moves through a cracked foundation. By Saturday, the men outside the feed store had a name for her, the doormat cow, and a small, cruel liturgy of what $50 should have bought instead. A used auger, half a load of hay, somebody's idea of a decent hat, which got a bigger laugh than the joke deserved, the way a room's laughter is really just pleasure in agreeing on who gets to be laughed at this season. "Still not looking any better," Grady announced at the counter one Saturday, loud enough to carry to the back where Silas was buying wire. "I give it till Christmas." Silas paid and said nothing. He'd learned already that answering only fed it. What none of them saw was what he did with her every morning before light. He walked her the fence line at dawn, watched her cross frost-hardened ground sure-footed where his neighbor's leggier stock stumbled, watched her stand through a hard October rain when 3 of his older cows crowded the lean-to, and when it passed, she didn't so much as shake herself dry. The water ran off that dense coat like it had somewhere else to be. He didn't know yet, not with words. He only knew the watching had stopped being curiosity. Eli Kestrel had worked the Boone place before Silas's father bought it. 81, half his teeth gone, still splitting his own kindling behind a cabin 2 miles up the county road. Silas pulled in on a gray Sunday in November with a jar of his mother's preserves as an excuse. Eli didn't stop working the draw knife when Silas pulled in, tipped his chin at the woodpile. "Heard you bought Grady Voss a whole season's worth of material." "Heard that myself." Silas sat on a round of cottonwood. "Want to ask you something. Rather you didn't laugh first." "Go on, then." Silas described her, the dip in the back, the doubled coat, the rain that ran off her like it had somewhere else to be. Eli set the knife across his knees, quiet long enough that Silas started to think he'd misjudged the man. "My grandfather ran cattle through here in the 80s. Not this 80s, 1880s. He turned a curl of ash between 2 fingers, looking past Silas now. "There was a winter, 86 into 87. Folks call it the big die-up now, the ones who call it anything. Whole herds gone, not sick, not shot, frozen and starved standing up." "What made the difference for the ones that lived?" "More than one thing if you want it told straight." Eli's voice had a small edge of caution in it, the caution of a man who doesn't like handing over a half-truth even to make a point land cleaner. "Flesh on their bones going into it, shelter where a man had the sense to leave it standing instead of feeding it to a wood stove. But the build mattered too, the thick ones, deep through the chest, a coat close enough to shed water and heavy enough underneath to hold a body's own heat. Ugly animals, most of them, by anybody's ring standards. All 3 things had to be there together. Coat alone doesn't save a starved animal, but a starved animal with the wrong coat goes down faster than one with the right one, and that difference is what buried some men's whole herds and left their neighbors standing." He looked at Silas directly. "Don't go telling yourself the coat's a magic trick. It's not. It's one good card in a hand that still needs the rest of them." Silas sat with that, the cold working through his coat. "You think she's got the rest of the hand, too?" "I think you'd best go find out instead of asking an old man to promise you something he can't." He didn't tell Silas what to do beyond that. He didn't need to. December came in hard and early, 2 weeks ahead of the almanac. Silas spent the weeks before it doing something he hadn't done for any of his other stock that autumn. He watched her flesh, her feed, made sure she wintered going in strong and not just going in furry, because Eli's warning had lodged in him and he wasn't willing to find out the hard way whether one good card was enough on its own. He lost 2 head that December regardless, an old cow, a late calf, to cold he hadn't moved fast enough to see coming. He grieved them the way a rancher grieves stock, quietly, with his hands, burying what the half-frozen ground would still let him bury. The doormat cow never once slowed her grazing. She'd gone into the cold with good flesh on her, a full season's grass in her, and the coat on top of that. All 3 of Eli's cards, together the way he'd said it had to be. While his other cattle bunched against the barn's leeward wall, backs hunched, breath heaving in ragged white clouds, she grazed the open pasture like the cold was a fact of the world that had simply never applied to her. Grady's herd, 400 head of clean, expensive stock, bred 15 careful years toward a standard never tested against a Montana winter without heavy feed to cover the gap, started losing animals by the 2nd week of January. Word came down the fence that he'd lost 11 head in a single week. It wasn't just embarrassment now. It was real money leaving his operation at a rate that showed on his face when he came into the feed store, a man doing arithmetic he didn't like in his head while he waited at the counter. He stopped driving past Silas's north pasture that winter. He had his own fences to check, and losses of his own now that had nothing funny left in them at all. It was in the worst of that same January that Grady's oldest hand, a heavy-set man named Purcell, who'd worked the Voss spread longer than Silas had been alive, said the thing that would be repeated at the feed store for a full week after, said it to a half-empty counter, not knowing or not caring that word traveled the way it always traveled in that valley. "Boone ought to sell that ugly cow to the rest of us for a stud fee. She's outlasted animals worth 10 times what he paid." He meant it as a compliment, in his rough way, but he delivered it the same way Grady always had, loud at the counter in front of an audience, as though the valley's right to comment on Silas Boone's business had never once been in question. It reached Silas within the hour, the way everything did, and it landed strange, not as vindication, not yet, but as one more version of people talking about him and his cow without asking him a single thing directly. The laughing had changed its shape. It hadn't stopped being about him. Spring came late and mean, but it came, and she calved, a bull calf, thick through the chest even at a day old, already showing the beginnings of that same coarse coat, standing and nursing within the hour while Silas crouched in the mud of the calving pen and watched with his throat tight in a way he didn't examine too closely. By the calf's 2nd week, 3 ranchers noticed the animal grazing beside its mother, square and unbothered on ground still half frozen at the edges. One of them was Otis Fell, who'd lost 9 head that January to cold Silas's own place barely registered. Otis stood at the fence a long while before he found anything to say. "That the cow Grady's boy's been running his mouth about? That's her. She didn't lose a pound the whole cold snap. Didn't believe what I was seeing." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I'd pay for a calf off her. Pay fair. More than fair." What moved through Silas wasn't triumph. It sat lower than that, closer to a debt finally being seen by somebody besides himself after a winter of being the only one who could. "She's not selling calves this year. Maybe next." Otis nodded like he'd expected exactly that, put his hat back on, and drove off without pushing it. By the 3rd winter, 3 of her offspring were out on Boone land, each carrying that same coarse coat and thick build, and all 3 had come through 2 hard winters running without the losses that had cost Grady and half the valley so dearly both years. Grady's own feed bills had climbed high enough by then that men at the counter had stopped joking about anybody's cattle at all. Nobody laughed at that fence line anymore. Nobody had standing left to. Grady came around that autumn, on foot, hat off. "I want to buy a bull off you, out of her line. I'll pay whatever's fair." Silas leaned on the gate, looking past him at the herd behind, thinner now than 3 autumns back, worn down by feed bills that had climbed a little higher every winter this stretch of country threw at them. $50 started this. Not bitterness, plain fact. Grady's jaw worked once after saying it, hat still off. And Silas didn't rush to make it easier, didn't say, "Forget it," didn't wave it off. Just let the man stand at the gate with his own words sitting between them a while. Because some things a person says need to be allowed to cost exactly as much as they cost. Bull calf's out of the second-year cow. Same line. He's yours if you want him. Fair price. Same as I'd sell anybody. They shook on it. No accounting out loud of who'd been right. Just two men agreeing a price on an animal neither would have looked at twice 5 years before, at a rail where one of them laughed and the other raised 2 fingers off a fence. Eli Kestrel died that following winter, in his sleep, and Silas was one of 6 men who carried him to the family plot behind the cabin. Eli's daughter, down from Great Falls to close the place up, put the old draw knife in Silas's hands without being asked. Said her father had mentioned him once or twice near the end as somebody worth passing a few things along to. The doormat cow lived to be 19, old for cattle, and died quietly in the same stretch of pasture where she'd first stood dry-backed through an October rain. Her line ran through better than 60 head across 4 ranches by then, Grady's among them. The valley had its own name for the line, and it didn't need explaining to anybody who lived through those winters. Silas's son, Daniel, was 11 the year she died. He found her that morning and came running for his father instead of crying out where he stood. Silas buried her on the rise at the north edge of the property, and stood thereafter with one hand flat on a fence post. Daniel stood beside him a long while in the cold, the two of them looking at the same turned ground. After a while, the boy reached up without a word and put his own hand on the post next to his father's, not copying him exactly, more like his hand had simply gone looking for something to hold on to and found the same place his father's had already found. Neither of them remarked on it. There wasn't anything about it that needed saying out loud. Some things aren't won at a rail in front of an audience in the time it takes a gavel to fall. Some things only get proven slow, one hard winter at a time by something that never once raised its voice on its own behalf. If a story like that one is the kind that stays with you a little after it's finished, farm lore's got more of this valley waiting. More mornings that started at a rail somebody laughed at once and never got the chance to laugh at the same way twice. $50 and a coat built for a winter nobody else saw coming. That's all it ever was. It was enough.